Welcome to Perspectives on Neurodiversity, a podcast dedicated to challenging myths and assumptions about neurodiverse life. I am your host, Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Some interviews for this season were recorded before I rebranded the podcast. I continue to blog as the Autistic Me, and that name will continue to be the social media handle for the blog and this podcast. Subscribe to Perspectives on Neurodiversity on your favorite podcasting platform. I hope you enjoy and learn from our discussions. Hello, and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. When advocates discuss neurodiversity, we include ADHD alongside autism, and many autistics also have ADHD diagnoses. As this audience knows, my daughters and I all have ADHD diagnoses. Our struggles differ, however, because ADHD takes many forms. On this episode of the podcast, I'm being joined by mental wellness advocate Carolina Gutiérrez. Carolina describes her ADHD as a superpower. She's harnessed her energy as a serial entrepreneur, health advocate, and counselor. Welcome to the podcast, Carolina.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So Carolina, let's talk about this. First off, what does ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, what does that mean to you?
The way I look at it for me is, at least at this stage in my life, I look at it from the positive standpoint that for me, it's highly creative. It's a constant flow of creativity, even to my detriment. Let's put it that way. It also means for me that I just notice that I process things differently than the way I perceive the rest of the world processing things. It's a way of living that for me sometimes feels overly sensitive. But at the end of the day, labels are challenging for me, because I think that neurodiversity is exactly that. It's diverse. And everybody just really embodies that in such a different way that, as much as I consider myself a mental health advocate and I talk about my ADHD, I don't think that you can package it up very easily in a few quick, well thought out sentences.
Your situation is very similar to that of my daughters. You're experiencing this from a female perspective. And that, I believe, is different. It was very difficult to get the diagnosis.
Yes.
And if I might ask, when were you diagnosed and how was that process for you, not only as a woman, but also as a minority? What was that process like getting an official diagnosis?
I was 33 years old. So let's put it that way. It took a very, very long time. No one thought that there was anything wrong. And so I went through life, and I laughingly tell this story. I was what I consider to be kind of this walking disaster. My teachers thought I was really bright, that I had a lot of potential. You would hear those lines all the time, that she just doesn't focus. She doesn't apply herself as much as we think she could. My mother would find my keys in the freezer. And that's a story that we laugh about to this day. As I grew, I started to realize, and especially as a young adult, I started to realize, I'm like, there's something off. Like I'm really trying to apply myself. I don't mean to leave my keys in the freezer or be caught up in so many different thoughts that I can't seem to keep one going. And I had many failed attempts at post-secondary education. And then I got into a program in my early 30s and I said, okay, listen, I'm not playing around anymore. Like there's something wrong and I'm too old to not want to do this properly. And so I went out of pocket to get a psychosocial assessment and it changed my life. It was the best thing that I could have done, but it wasn't something that others thought that I needed. Let's put it that way. I look back at high school and it shocks me because, I had friends that had been, had their differences diagnosed. And I don't even remember what some of them, their diagnosis was, but they would test differently, right? Like they would go to the testing center when we had exams and stuff like that. They had the accommodations. Meanwhile, I'm struggling in math. Like math has always been something that was just a mountain that I couldn't seem to climb. And I remember being in grade 11 math. And here in Canada at the time, there was very, very few careers, routes in university that you could get into without grade 11 math. And so I did grade 11 math 7 times. 7 times I would walk into the guidance counselor's office because we needed to have our form signed to say you can retake this. And 7 times they just scribbled it and ushered me out. And no one ever stopped to say, what's happening? Why is it that you're needing to take this? Should we sit down? Should we look at what's going on? Because I was okay in my other classes. Not great. Like I wasn't a straight A student, but I was getting along fine. But I think because it just shows up so differently in women, right? I wasn't a person that I didn't cause problems in school. I didn't draw much attention to myself. The opposite was true. I understand it now, but I was always the helper because it got me to move around. It allowed me to get out of my seat. It allowed me to not be confined to the rigors of traditional ways of learning. And so I was constantly volunteering for stuff. I was kind of the helper. And so it created this perfect storm that kept me under the radar to be really figure out what was going on.
I think it's important to emphasize you paid out of pocket for this.
Absolutely.
And when we've had guests from Australia, Ireland, other nations that have, in theory, healthcare provided,
yes,
that's not the case for a lot of mental health issues, some prescription drugs that are necessary for us to succeed. And so I want to make the point that you had to pay out of pocket, just like so many people we've talked to on this podcast. And it's heartbreaking that this is not a problem in just one nation. It is a problem in Australia. It's a problem in Ireland. It's a problem in Canada.
And it's not just out of pocket a little bit. It's a lot. And had I not gotten into the program as a mature student that I got into, I requested a subsidy from the program to get diagnosed. Had I not gotten the subsidy from the school for that independent diagnosis, because I requested it before school started. So I applied for the diagnosis in July and I got it in August. I wouldn't have been able to afford it at the time. It's $3,500. I didn't have that money. Now I look back at it and I tell people, save that money and get it because it's life-changing. Especially the one that I don't know how other people's diagnosis is, but mine was really clear in regards to what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What is my dominant learning sense? What are some of the tips, tools, and tricks in order to make best use of it? What is my least effective way of learning? And so that has translated not only into school, but into work. I make a living that way now. So it's very empowering, but it's, for a lot of people, it's just not feasible to pay $3,500 out of pocket.
And what is shocking is that's not just in the US and Canada that's $3,500. I have heard as bad as 4,000 euros. That is a significant amount of money if you're paying 4,000 euro for a basic diagnosis to help you get services.
That's exactly it.
The option is you can be on the waiting list for some screening in some of these countries, but I know in the UK, the waiting list right now can be anywhere from a year to a year and a half. What are you supposed to do in the meantime?
Yeah, but not only that, it's the quality of what you get in those screenings. So it is not the in-depth screening that I got. You don't get those clearly outlined. Had I just gotten a diagnosis without saying your dominant sense is listening, and then taking all of those insights that provided and then using the learning technologists at school. Like, to me, that was this perfectly baked cake that really empowered me. And not everybody gets that cake, right? It's unfortunate, but the quality of what you get in our subsidized healthcare just doesn't match it. Like you have family physicians that are like, yeah, I think you do have it. Here you go. And you walk out with a diagnosis and you're like, what? Like, I've heard people say that, and I'm always shocked that that's how it works. That, not how it works, but that's what certain people are getting.
When you are a young woman in our cultures, and I know that I can only speak to our cultures, I do not know, the rest of the world's experiences, but You mentioned being told, oh, you're just not applying yourself. You're lazy. You're careless. By the age of 12, you were trying to be an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And yet you have teachers telling you you're lazy and not applying yourself.
Exactly.
I'm trying to reconcile this for my daughters. Listeners know my oldest just turned 10, the youngest is 8, and the 10-year-old, it's always, you're just not focused. You just don't try hard enough. Why do you think this occurs in our classrooms and in our workspaces where we're telling women who are talented and are passionate about success, well, the reason you didn't do that particular task is you're lazy or you're careless?
Part of it is, I'm 43 now, so I would hope that things have changed a little bit in regards to what we see success as. I think that's shifting in our world. But back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s for me, success was viewed in a very particular way. And I just didn't match that. And I still don't match that perception or that mold. But it was very disconcerting because I was raised with a ridiculous, I call it almost donkey-like work ethic, in that you work until it's done. It really is something that I think not only cultural, but also a generational gift in my family. We have a very, very strict work ethic. And I saw that. And so it wasn't for a lack of trying, because I was always moving. I was always doing something. I was always pushing. Yeah, it's very disheartening because you're like, I'm genuinely trying. And I think for years, I bought into, well, maybe I wasn't trying properly, or maybe I wasn't trying enough. When I was about 18 or 19, I remember saying to myself, I'm like, I can't live like this. Like I have to get my stuff in order. I don't know how to do that. And I really thought it was a personal failing on my part. Like I remember my mom saying to me, I'm worried what life as a mother is going to be like for you, because I would find my keys in the freezer. I would have to have multiples of stuff because I would lose it all the time. My room was a constant disaster. I was always losing stuff, always. And I just couldn't, really kind of get it together. And so around 18 or 19, I'm like, okay, clearly I suck at this. So what am I going to do? And so for about 10 years, or maybe even more, maybe like 12 years, I read everything that I could get my hands on when it came to being organized. So I would read blogs and those organization shows were starting to come out in TV at the time. And, I would make sure to watch everyone that I could. I would buy books, but it was more like systems and tools. I didn't recognize it as ADHD or neurodiversity. And so for me, when I got that diagnosis, that's why I really say it really changed my life. And I call it my superpower now, because I had 12 plus years of studying it from almost like an academic perspective of getting organized. And then all of a sudden having this insight of what it actually was and where I could focus it with the strengths that I had with it. And it was like all of a sudden my efforts were on steroids, because I had the accurate snapshot to apply everything that I had been trying to learn for all of those years before that.
To get through the day, the week, the month, the school year, I have a lot of calendars, checklists.
Absolutely.
I color code things. I'm reminded of the click pins that used to have 6 colors in them. You could click red or click blue.
Yes, I remember those.
That's what I do with pins. I actually, sitting here, I have a stack of pins nearby that are in a rainbow of colors. High priority things get red. I color code them by the topic I'm working on. Looking at my folders, I use green for economics and I use blue for the autism stuff. I have to color code. I have to sort. I have to have these tools to keep myself on track. My diagnoses weren't consolidated until I was, I want to say 37, 38. I was developing, as you said, all of those tools to survive.
Yeah, and it is survive.
Without knowing why.
Absolutely. And it's not an exaggeration when you say survive. I completely resonate with that, because it is surviving. It's not thriving. It's just making it through the day.
You mentioned taking the same class, the grade 11 math, over and over, but not giving up. I believe I've attended 7 post-secondary institutions. I would need to count because I would struggle. I would start and I would struggle and I wouldn't understand why I'm not getting through this. Undergraduate was difficult enough, but it was more contained. You're on campus, you're living in the community. So undergraduate, there were a lot more supports, even artificially, just because of the residential college setting.
Your life is organized for you.
Yeah, I lived in something called faculty in residence, which meant a faculty member lived on every floor. So you'd have a professor saying, okay, now it's time to get to class. And it's like, oh yeah, I should go.
Right.
Once you get out of that setting of undergraduate and into graduate school, it was, completely on your own. I really struggled, and I had my calendars. I have my see-through binders with on the insert where I can see it, the calendar and the what's coming up. It wasn't enough. The old day runner and then the Palm Pilot. So how do you turn that organization into a strength where it doesn't just feel like a crutch, but it becomes a tool for success?
I don't know about you, but I'm a big believer in divine timing. Like I said, I got my testing in August. It was 6 hours over 2 days. And then it took about a month to get the paperwork and the diagnosis and everything. I had already started my program. I was a month in before I got the paperwork. And my first essay was due. And I remember it taking me almost 6 hours to proofread my essay. I remember sitting in bed doing the last kind of edit because it was just little things, right? Like it wasn't the gist of the essay, but it was spelling. Like I'm horrendous at spelling. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can spend 6 hours to proofread an essay. And I was in a social work program, which is essays up the wazoo every week, every other week. You're submitting these 6, 10, 20-page essays. I cannot have a 6-hour edit session for this. And then I was pulling in my husband. My husband's like, honey, I'll help you, but I have to work, right? Like there's only so much that I can do. When I got the diagnosis or the actual written diagnosis, my counselor at school said, as soon as you get it, bring it in and we're going to have you sit down with a learning technologist. And I had no idea what a learning technologist was. And I was like, okay, sure. And the learning technologist, I probably light candles to her to this day because one, she was speaking my language because technology has always been something that came super easy to me, always. And she's like, okay, so they're saying that here listening is your strongest suit. So when you proofread, you should use a tool that reads back to you. So you just throw your essay into, there's lots of different ones out there, and it'll just read back to you and you'll be able to hear. And I was like, what? Okay. And the next essay that I did, which was immediately after that first one that took me 6 hours, I proofread in 15 minutes. I cried after that because I was like, oh my God, I can do this. How did I not know about and obviously I didn't, and the tools might have not been around when I was in high school, but I was like, wow, okay. It's funny that you talk about color coding because for me, my diagnosis says I cannot color code because I get lost in aesthetic details too much. And so instead of it helping me, it would be a hindrance to me. Really, I succeeded. Like I graduated with honors. I could have continued on to a graduate program. I chose not to. That was the original plan. But, things changed. You're an adult. And I think had this happened to me when I was younger, had I had been able to have this diagnosis, I probably would have continued on. I probably would have gone on to get my PhD. But it just, timing again, right? Being in your 30s, thinking about that, having, being in a relationship, having adult things that you have to worry about. I didn't have the luxury to continue on that path. But let me tell you, that learning technologist just really just changed my life. And I, to this day, take the tools that I was exposed to in that session, in those sessions, because I kept going back. And she goes, I wish other students would come back as frequently as you're coming back because they don't realize how much value this is. And I'm like, this is gold. And so those tools I use to this day in my business, I recommend to other business owners because they have so much more applications than just school. I write all the time in my business. I have to write blog posts. I have to write reports for clients, and it's read back to me. Not taking notes. That was another thing. I was not to take notes, and they were even willing to, I would have qualified for somebody to sit in the classroom and take notes for me. But I didn't want to do that. And she said, okay, if you don't want to do that, then record your sessions, and all you're doing is you're sitting there, and when there's a point that you're like, oh, I want to write that down, you just have to look at the time in the recording and say, this was said 15 minutes in, right? So I just put 15 minutes and, one word that maybe kind of will jog my memory as to what it is. I started loving education again. I don't want to say I didn't like learning. I've always been a lifelong learner, but it became easy where it wasn't like that before.
There are cultural differences in how mental wellness is treated. At least in my experience, some cultures are more resistant to accepting the idea of a diagnosis versus saying you're just lazy, you don't work hard, this is how we do things.
Correct.
I've dealt with students who are from some Asian cultures in particular where they say, no, you just have to work a lot harder. And the poor kid is nearly broken by the time that experience is through, just because the self-worth is so attacked.
Absolutely.
It's your fault. It's you that's flawed. Is there a cultural aspect to what you were dealing with?
Probably. I know from a family perspective. So my family's from Colombia. Both my parents are born there. I was born here in Canada and raised here in Canada. I do speak Spanish fluently.
One of the sayings I know one of my Chilean friends says is, you work from sun to moon.
Sure.
And then I point out the moon doesn't always come out. So what happens in those days?
I would say the more appropriate saying translated is dirty clothes are washed at home. So even if you do have challenges, first of all, I remember talking to my mom when I got this diagnosis, didn't acknowledge it. I think she's acknowledging it now because she's seeing my advocacy work. She's seeing me speak about it. She's seeing how I've made a business around it. But when I first got it, it was kind of like, yeah, I don't think that's, I don't know if that's true. I think that's mental health across the board. I also think, like I remember telling one of my aunts, who I think is very open, highly educated, same thing. She goes, oh yeah, that's what her exact words were. That's what teachers that don't like students here label them as. And I was like, wow. And I'm thinking, how many people, like just with that broad stroke of that belief, how many lives are you dampening? How many people won't be getting the help because of beliefs like that? Definitely there's a resistance there. I think to just getting any help, period. Things are changing. I see that now. My last visit to visit family in Colombia was right before COVID. And I think that millennials are doing and I'm an old millennial. But I think they're doing a fantastic job in really kind of highlighting the need for that. J Balvin, this Colombian mega superstar singer, tours with his psychiatrist or his psychologist, openly speaking about his anxiety and stuff like that. So I think that there is progress, but definitely there is a cultural component, at least to how things were handled for me. I think also in regards to the expectations that you have as a woman and how ADHD presents. So going back to my mother being worried about, when I was going to have my family, because you have to keep a clean home. And things need to be tidy, and people judge you on that. And how are you going to find a man that's going to be okay with you not being, being able to handle that? And I remember being 8 years old and saying, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to have a cleaning lady. And my mother would throw that in my face all the time. But yeah, it's just a culmination of a whole bunch of different layers that you're dealing with when you deal with something that's undiagnosed this way, because you have cultural expectations, you have societal expectations, you have gender expectations, you have your own expectations. And it can be a lot, right? It can be a lot. And, the more that I've read about it, I hear what's called of these women that that are undiagnosed in their 50s, 60s. I've heard it say that it's called the lost generation, because it's all these people that we suffer the consequences and are misdiagnosed. And so a lot of these people are like, well, they suffer from depression. And I was like, well, if everyone says that you're not trying hard enough and you're giving everything that you got, how do you not think that you're going to suffer from depression? But you're treating the depression and you're not treating what's actually the issue. And so they're improperly medicated, improperly diagnosed, with a self-esteem that's just dragging on the floor, and then and I don't have children, so I can't speak to this, but I've seen people that do have children add that component of having children and you not being able to get your act together. And it is a toxic cocktail of crap that we're just constantly drinking without having the help that we need.
Some advocates say that being neurodiverse causes traumatic experiences and depression, anxiety, other side effects. So the comorbidity isn't that ADHD or autism go with depression, but that the depression, the trauma, the PTSD comes from being poorly evaluated. As you said, the negative feedback, you're constantly feeling inferior, like a failure. It's something I'm open about, that I constantly feel like I'm not good enough because I drop the ball so often. For a lot of us, the education system, the workplace, these become reinforcing agents for the negativity.
And also, if you look at the numbers of neurodiversity in entrepreneurship, they're sky high. We don't find that understanding and that success in traditional work environments. But entrepreneurship comes with its own double-edged sword, because it creates a mix of circumstances that has its own pressures. 3 to 4 times higher suicide rate amongst entrepreneurs than the general population. 70% or higher instances of mental health issues, either directly or indirect, or either diagnosed or undiagnosed. And you got to look at, it's all these people that have different ways of looking at the world and different ways of doing things that are pushed into these careers because they can't find the peace and the acceptance in the regular corporate setting. I know I was in the corporate setting for 6 years before I went out on my own. And it would be great initially. Eventually, the disorganization would kick in. I'd start to drop balls. But the other thing was, I was bored as ever. After 2 months, I'm like, this is no longer a challenge. And for somebody that is as creative as I am and who's always thinking about different ways of doing things and always, kind of reanalyzing, I worked for an insurance company, and I say that I felt like my soul was slowly dying every day being in that environment. And I think that there's less trauma there, to be honest with you, because at least you don't have someone saying you should try harder, or you should have, because you know what you're doing, right? And I think I'm passionate about that, because now part of what I do is I help entrepreneurs, neurodiverse or otherwise, because there's a ton of different conditions in the entrepreneurship community that people suffer from, in regards to how to get those systems in place so that they're not dropping the ball, but systems that work for them. So a lot of people say, tell me the perfect system. I'm like, it doesn't exist. I need to know about you. Kind of similar, very similar to kind of my diagnosis. And I'm like, okay, when you see a desk full of stuff on it, does that make you anxious? Or do you know exactly where everything is? And depending on that answer and a couple of other answers, then there's a system that we can build around that. You don't adjust to a system. A system is created for you.
When you talk about the entrepreneurship and neurodiversity, the emergence of the gig economy, in some ways, it's the double-edged sword for those of us with differences.
Absolutely.
Everyone says, oh, be a freelancer. And that is, in some ways, a nice path. You can work when you are most energetic any time of night. If you're a freelance writer, freelance artist, graphic artist, programmer, You can set your own hours, do your web work when you want to do it, or your graphic arts or whatever. And there are a lot of places now online. I can think of a dozen where you can put yourself out there for work for hire. But the flip side of that is then you have to think of the legalities. You've got to get a business license. You've got to pay the taxes. You've got to figure out how you pay into your state or federal or national programs. What sounds appealing at first, I find a lot of neurodiverse individuals say, I'm a great artist or I'm a great writer. I have this talent. I should be doing it. Everyone tells me I should do it. But they are quickly overwhelmed by the fact that, yes, but now you have to collect the taxes. You have to file, quarterly report. And what they didn't bargain for was that they were
becoming business owners. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It is a double-edged sword. And that's only part of the double-edged. Let's call it a four-edged sword, because there's a whole bunch of other edges that you haven't talked about there. It is the psychosocial and emotional impact that entrepreneurship has in people's lives as well. For example, whether you're neurodiverse or not, entrepreneurship is extremely lonely. No one talks about that. And we already have difficulty as neurodivergents connecting with people. I don't know. Okay, let me not talk in blanket statements, because not everybody might fall under that, but I know I have that difficulty. Now we're creating a scenario that actually has that built in. So then our disconnect with other people becomes even greater. There's a lot of shame, guilt, because people think, I started a business. Well, you start a business, but you don't. Like it's a year or two before you're actually taking off, getting some income, right? No one talks about that. So we're living in this quiet shame. Okay. There's the poker face. The poker face, I sometimes call it a poker face. Sometimes I call it the armadillo back because it's, oh yeah, everything's okay. And meanwhile, you're inside, you're like, I haven't been paid in 2 months. I don't know how I'm going to pay my mortgage. But we have to pretend that everything's okay, because it's all about, how we show up, and maybe people aren't going to want to work with me because they don't think I'm successful if I share what's really going on. And we don't really have opportunities sometimes to connect with other entrepreneurs on that level. We have the opportunity to speak with other entrepreneurs, maybe to do business with them, but no one's saying like, hey, I haven't slept great in months because my anxiety is through the roof, because I'm only getting a trickle of income in. And so there's just so many other aspects to business ownership that I think a lot of people either don't know about or don't wish to talk about. I always say entrepreneurs are considered the modern day superheroes, right? We're creating opportunities for people. We're launching new technologies, whatever it is, whatever zone of genius it is that you work in. There's a huge cost that comes with that. And we really need to talk about that, especially because so many neurodivergent people are forced to take the route of business.
As we see more neurodiverse women starting their own businesses, there aren't the same number of role models as for men. And the ones that we have or that we point to that I can think of, like Mrs. Fields Cookies. Was it Mary Kay Cosmetics?
The owner of Spanx. She's been very successful.
In some ways, we are reinforcing, think about it. We've got baking cookies. Yes. We've got makeup, women's clothes that hide. We don't have the same types of role models. We don't have, here's a great freelance editor. Here is a great computer programmer, and she did this. We have a deficit of female, minority, and neurodiverse individuals out there as role models. I can point to, as a white male neurodiverse, we've got Elon Musk. We've got Bill Gates or Steve Jobs as being different, unique personalities, notoriously driven. We don't have those for everybody. They're very similar. Right? White male from the upper middle class who then built a business. And it's much easier to start a business and build it from the upper middle than from the bottom.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, we can say, okay, Apple started in a garage, but they had a garage.
Yeah. I'll give you one. I don't know if she's neurodiverse, but she is a minority. She started Canva. She was the programmer for Canva. I don't remember her name, but I believe she's from New Zealand or Australia. Canva is wildly successful. It's an online program for creating graphics, for those that don't know. But yeah, there is a lack. And I think that just ties into a whole slew that would probably be enough for another program. But for example, we just don't get the same funding. We don't get the same support. You know, the amount of times that I've been in a networking room and my business idea that I'm making money in and that I help business owners and that they're interested in bringing into their own organization. They're interested in having me come in and say, okay, you know, what would you recommend technology wise? That I've been belittled and talked down to. Oh, your little business. And I'm like, why are you wanting to bring me in and then calling my business a little business? And not from, yeah, it's a small business, but it wasn't delivered in that sense. It wasn't meant that way. I think the reality is that there is a shift in how business is being done, and women are bringing in that shift. The way women do business is much more collaborative. I think social media is a perfect example of a business that has a bit more of a feminine touch to it in the collaboration, in looking for comments, and in really that, I don't want to say synergy, but that community way of building versus I'm right, I'm the only thought leader, I win, you know, a very kind of traditional model of how doing businesses. So I think in a way that's shifting. Would I like there to be many more role models? Sure. Look at the one, what's that business owner? She was neurodiverse. She led a tech company and then she crashed and burned and there was fraud in the company, everything. It was some DNA technology. She was, unfortunately, you know, that would have been a great one had it worked out. But I think she's on trial now where she was convicted of some type of crime surrounding that. But yeah, I think also one of the things to consider, and I hate to say this, but I've seen certain businesses succeed for women based on their looks, right? I think that still plays a big role, especially in the B2B space, because you're dealing with men. I belong to networking groups where they were 85% men. And you see some people that you're looking at the business and you're like, I'm surprised that there's a superficiality that still applies in how people are selected, just like it's in the workforce. I've been told to not pronounce my name correctly when I introduce myself because it might be difficult for other people to repeat it. Or when I said my name in on my voicemail, I said it properly. I didn't anglicize it like I did in school. And it's like, you should consider switching that. There's a lot of layers that still apply to why we don't have those role models. And I think it's changing. I really do. You were seeing some phenomenal businesses in the online community that are switching that. More than 50% of entrepreneurs in the online space are women. I think that the stats like 60 plus, and it's 60 plus making lifestyle businesses where, and I say lifestyle in that, not that they're not working, but they get to pick up their kids after school, or, the traditional ways that we would measure success. It's not just money. It's also time and health and well-being. So there's a shift, just like everything else, I think, right now in the world. It's shaking things up.
You mentioned time, and early in our conversation, you mentioned blocking out time. Entrepreneurs, and let's be honest, a lot of those with ADHD or autistic traits will get into hyper-focus mode where you burn yourself out because you go 36 hours straight on a problem, or you don't eat properly, you don't leave your desk. Yes, you're creating great things, but at the end of the week,
at what cost?
You're catatonic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you explain how you approach blocking out time and why that's essential for success for those of us who need those guide rails?
One of the things that I learned from that learning technologist, we're always going back to that woman, is she's like, use as many calendars as you need. One calendar, but have it in multiple places. Calendar on my phone, I would have a calendar on my computer. I would then print out calendars and stick them in each binder. I'm constantly being reminded at every turn. I would have one in the kitchen. I would have one in my office. I had like 4 or 5. Wherever I turned, I was constantly being reminded that this was going on, that these deadlines were happening. So then the time blocking was a natural result of that constant reminder, because I'm like, okay, well, I know that this is coming up. And so it was a matter of learning about yourself. I think really that self-discovery and the way that you process time is something that you need to figure out in order for that tool to be really successful for you. Time blocking, I don't just time block work. I time block my bedtime. I time block my non-computer, non-screen time before bed, because, and I just actually wrote an article on LinkedIn about this, because I know that I can be as creative as, and especially in the middle of the night where everything is quiet and, no one is coming in to bother you. And I can put on some podcasts that I can just kind of listen to in the background and be just producing and bringing my ideas to life, because that's really what makes me happy. But I pay for it. I'm 40 now. I pay for it. I can't function as normally the next day. I don't recover so quickly. So it's honoring those rituals that in my time, just as much as I honor the time that I use to produce for my clients, to make money, to work on my business. So I time block prayer. I time block meditation. I time block walking. I time block rubbing my dog's belly. I block my sleep. I block the 2 hours before sleep. So you look at my calendar and it looks overwhelming. For a non-neurodivergent person, they look at that and they're like, oh my God. My husband, we're almost positive that he's neurodivergent too, autistic, but we're waiting for that diagnosis. He, on the other hand, sees that and he gets overwhelmed. He's like, I can't look at this. This is too much. I don't know how you function like that. But to me, I see that and I see peace. I literally feel like I can breathe deeper, because everything that hidden load that we keep in our head is out there and written. And so I know that I don't have to worry about it, because I'm just constantly glancing, saying, oh, that's next. Oh, that's coming up. Using alarms properly to remind you of that. And it might be setting 10, 12, 14 alarms. Who cares? It's your life and you can choose to use it. There is no system that you should adjust to. You create a system around you.
Consulting that you do for entrepreneurs and small businesses, you offer this online anywhere, so people can connect to you no matter where they are.
Yes.
You have a very easy to remember web address, which will be included in the show notes too. But would you mind mentioning that to people?
Sure. It's bizinorder.com. The business is Business in Order. If you don't mind, I've actually, we're just in the final stages of creating a program for new business owners or young business owners called the Organized Business Bootcamp. And it's all about creating systems in the 9 different areas that every business has to stay on top of things. Because what happened is that people that were new in business, you don't have a big budget, right? You don't. You're struggling just to get that basic income coming in. And so I really wanted to create something that people at that stage could afford. You don't get to work with me personally because it's just not in the budget, but I've put in all of my tips and tricks and everything that I've learned in regards to getting other businesses organized as well as my own into this self-study program, so that you're able to start creating the systems that work around your needs.
This is also available online. So what they do is they use it at their own pace.
Absolutely. It will be available soon. It's been in beta for the last 1.5 years because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just something that I created and put out there. I had a test group that I brought in to give me feedback, to make sure that they were at different stages in their business, they were different businesses, and that they learned differently. What happens a lot of times, if you have listeners that have taken online training, is they sell you a great product. They're like, oh, this is fantastic. This is going to change your life. And then you take it and you're like, this was kind of disappointing. This isn't exactly what I thought I was going to get out of it. So I really wanted to be authentic and genuine in regards to the help that I was putting out there, because at the end of the day, for me, what drives me, and I have several businesses, so this is not just business in order. For me, what drives me is that people find peace and clarity when they're in business, because that is so elusive. When you lack peace and clarity, whether you're neurodivergent or not, that's a huge toll that you pay for that, right? There's a huge emotional, mental, and physical price that your well-being surrenders when you don't have that in your life. So I really wanted to create a program that spoke to bringing that, because it would be common when I'd be working with people and I'd be like, look, here's a tool that will, and I, teach them a tool or make the suggestion. They would be like, and you could hear them breathe deeper. And they'd be like, oh my God, this is going to be so good. Like, I'm not going to have to carry this in my head anymore. And as somebody with ADHD, I know what that's like. I know what it's like to carry this constant stream of ideas and thoughts that haunt you. It really came from a place of compassion when creating that.
When you started your own businesses as early as 12, how much of that do you think was because of the ADHD?
If you asked me then, I'd be like, oh no, I just got this idea. But as I look back at it, and as you're asking me now, it probably had a lot to do with it. I think there was a couple of things. I didn't grow up in a family of means. I wasn't one of these lucky people that got a weekly allowance or anything like that. So I knew that I needed to kind of make my own way that way if I wanted to have some extra spending cash. But it was just also constantly floating ideas that I'm like, Like one of the businesses that I had when I was in high school was we had a family member that worked at a chocolate manufacturer. And the chocolate manufacturer, if the chocolate isn't perfect, and it was a very boutique kind of little shop that existed here in Canada. It's not around anymore. It's called Laura Secor. If it wasn't perfect, they'd throw it out. They would come home with these bags and bags and bags of this imperfect chocolate. And I was like, well, I don't like chocolate to this day. That's the irony. I don't like chocolate, but all my friends did. And I was always seeing people in school eating chocolate. And I was like, well, and I wanted to go to prom, and I didn't have enough money for the ticket. And I wanted a new dress. And my mom's like, well, if you figure out the ticket, we still don't have money for the shoes and the dress that you want and everything. So, and I'm like, okay. I said, can I have the chocolate? They're like, you don't even like chocolate. And I'm like, I know, but can I have it? And they're like, okay, sure. And so I walked around with a bag full of chocolate in high school selling. I'd sell it for 25 cents, these broken pieces. And people are like, okay, sure. And then the potheads got to know me in school, and they would come after me when they were wanting to satisfy the munchies. And then I just got known as, hey, Carolina always has chocolate. And so, people, we'd be mid-class and they're like, hey, do you have your chocolate bag? And I'm like, sure, 25 cents. And so I made enough money to go to prom and buy all that stuff. And so part of it was the work ethic that I saw my mom. She was always hustling in some way. Part of it was the ideas that ADHD brought. Part of it was economic necessity.
And it all came together to guide you towards this entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So currently, I run 4 businesses concurrently, and part of it is the ADHD because the ideas are constantly coming, but part of it was what I learned in regards to systems. I would never be able to run this many businesses, making money in all of them, if I didn't have systems that ran part of it, that helped me automate it, or that helped me capture the ideas to then delegate them out to others on my team. This is not absolutely a one-woman show, no, but it's about creating a system that works around your particular way that neurodiversity shows up in your life.
I want to thank you for spending an hour on the Autistic Me podcast. Carolina Gutiérrez has, again, can you give the website, and I'll put it in the show notes?
Sure. It's Biz in Order, BIZ for our American friends, inorder.com.
The type of service you provide is business consulting focused primarily on organization.
Correct. Yes. 50% of the business is consulting. So we bring in, it might be technology, it might be process improvement. It's all depending on what it is that the client is needing, or creating systems within the business so that you're not responding on a moment's notice. You're being able to go in and say, okay, this is the role and this is what I need from it. And then the other 50% of the business, I have a team of virtual assistants that once our businesses get organized, then they're in a much better place to delegate out and to be able to really leverage the power of delegating when you're getting a business organized.
And you have used your ADHD superpower to create this series of entrepreneur-driven businesses.
Correct. I would say that my ADHD is probably 70% of the driving force behind that.
That is a great message to hear as a parent to two girls who need those role models out there like yourself, showing them that it's possible. You can find your strengths and how you work best and maximize how you work best.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not used to hearing myself labeled as a role model, but that's very nice of you to say. Thank you.
And I think that the key message there you're giving is organize in the method that works best for you, just like we tell teachers to try to find the best learning and teaching strategies for a given class. Too often there are books that say this is the way to organize a business. As you mentioned, my color coding wouldn't work for you. I do everything by calendar, probably very similar in approach though. My calendar is on my phone. It's printed out in a drawer. It's printed out in binders. It's on the computers. But I had to find that strategy on my own. And I think it's so great now that those of us who have been there before diagnoses were common in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s, we have learned from those adventures that we had in education in the workplace. And now hopefully we can help others find ways to organize their lives and find some peace. And that there is key too. When you're organized, you're not as stressed and you can find that inner peace to enjoy the success.
My business tagline is we help you find peace, time, and profits through organizing your business backend. And I put peace purposely as the first thing, because without peace, it's just another thing that drags us down instead of fueling us.
I think that is a valuable way to look at success. After work, after whatever you do as a freelancer, as an entrepreneur, as an employee, when you go home, do you feel at peace? If all you're worried about is the next day's job and the next day's work or the week after's work or the next project, if you never have that moment of peace, what's this all for?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Like, you hit the nail on the head so well with that, because honestly, and what I've been shifting my marketing to kind of tie all my businesses together. And what I label that is business enlightened, because it's not for the sake of running a business, or it's not for the sake of doing for doing's sake. You need to look at that bigger picture. You need to look at what's important in your life. You started this podcast because you're a father to two girls that you really want to be able to find different ways of having them succeed in a world that isn't necessarily perfectly built for their needs, right? And I'm sure there's other reasons behind it, but that's a really important driving force. And so I think that a lot of times we lose sight of that. And in every endeavor that I choose to focus my energy on, that is my big why, right? It's making sure that you recognize the person behind that, you recognize the value that they bring, and that our life is created for more than just doing.
Thank you so much, Carolina Gutiérrez, for being on the podcast. I really appreciate this hour we've spent together.
Me too. Thank you for having me. This was awesome.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Perspectives on Neurodiversity. Remember to subscribe to the podcast, and please leave a review if you found the discussion useful. Don't forget to read the Autistic Me blog and follow my posts on social media. Look for Autistic Me as one word on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Links to the Autistic Me on social media are included in the show notes. I am Christopher Scott Wyatt, speaking as the Autistic Me. Thank you for listening.